What was the first console you played Super Mario Bros. On? Was it the NES, or were you someone who first played it on the Wii Virtual Console? No matter the case, we can all agree that this game has been re-released to death. But somehow, it's always the same version of this game. It's not remade. Well, unless you play Super Mario All-Stars on the SNES or Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. So how is that possible?
Emulation! Almost every modern Nintendo console has some sort of emulation embedded into the console itself, with the most popular official Nintendo emulation being
Virtual Console. The Virtual Console was available on the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS, where you could buy older video games for modern platforms. The Wii had the NES, SNES, Nintendo 64, Arcade, Master System, Mega Drive, Commodore 64, MSX, TurboGrafx 16, and the Neo Geo AES.
Have you heard of almost half of these consoles?
This was back when the Wii was attempting to be like the ultimate Nintendo console, so you could play every Wii game, almost every Gamecube game, and legacy titles from several platforms that some of them weren't even Nintendo. Some great games are available, like Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and more, but there are many weird exclusions. On the Nintendo 64, out of the 3 Mario Party games, only Mario Party 2 was available. The emulation of these consoles was fantastic on the Wii, alongside a great controller to go with it. See, with most of these consoles, the controller they originally used for the game had a lot more buttons, so Nintendo created the Classic Controller. The Classic Controller takes after an SNES controller, but with 2 joysticks in order to also work with the Nintendo 64. For some reason you couldn't use the Gamecube controllers for these games, which was always annoying, but the Classic Controller was a great way to play these games. A bit of a bonus is if you have an SNES Mini, you can use these controllers on the Wii to play the SNES games the best way possible. But if you also own an SNES Mini, you could just play the games on the SNES Mini. The 3DS. The 3DS had a bit of a different Virtual Console, alongside re-releasing games in different ways. Nintendo had 3D Classics, a way to play some of their older games with 3D, alongside Sega doing pretty much the same thing. But these weren't really emulation, so they kinda don't count. When it came to Virtual Console, Nintendo focused more on its handheld history, all starting when they cut the price of the 3DS down from unaffordable to somewhat affordable, and gave away 10 free NES games and 10 free Game Boy Advance games. The NES games are emulated, no doubt about it, but the Game Boy Advance games are truly interesting. If you don't remember, the DS and DS Lite had a Game Boy Advance slot, and directly had the parts to run a Game Boy Advance game, but when the DSi came out, they got rid of that slot. However, they never actually got rid of the ability to play Game Boy Advance games. The DSi still has the capability to play Game Boy Advance games, therefore the 3DS also still has the capability to play Game Boy Advance games. So the games available here are just the digital files for the games on the 3DS, the same way you'd buy a 3DS retail game or buy a DSiWare game on the 3DS, making it technically not emulation. The 3DS is capable of Game Boy Advance emulation through hacking, but I guess if it's easier to do it without emulation, you may as well.
I think this is why Game Boy Advance games just weren't available on the eShop, because it was just too difficult to figure out this not emulation but sort of emulation method of having them available in the first place.
The 3DS had NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Gear, TurboGrafx 16, and SNES Virtual Console. However, the SNES games were available exclusively on the new 3DS, as the old 3DS couldn't handle SNES games. What? Yeah, the old 3DS is perfectly capable of playing the SNES, and it works pretty well too. Maybe Nintendo really wanted something to sell the new 3DS, or hackers could do what Nintendo don't. Of course, the big selling point of Virtual Console on the 3DS was the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. This is actually the very first way I played Super Mario Land and so many other classics. Heaps, and I mean heaps, of Game Boy games were available on the 3DS and worked perfectly. There was even the introduction of save states, which means you can finally save, die, and go back to where you were before. This makes games like Super Mario Land so much easier. The 3DS is actually the console with the most amount of individual Mario games to play, with there being 101. So obviously, this is where Virtual Console peaked.
But after every peak, there must be a downfall.
Did the Wii U do anything right?
Yeah, nah.
The Wii U had NES, SNES, Nintendo 64, TurboGrafx-16, MSX, Game Boy Advance, and DS. The Nintendo 64 games looked horrendous on the Wii U, with it being incredibly dark on the console. But the Wii U having Game Boy Advance and DS games was incredible. DS games being available on the Wii U? What a perfect console to have them on! The Wii U has 2 screens, just like the DS. So you can make one screen the TV and one screen the bottom. It's just incredible. And to make it even better, you could just play the Virtual Console games on the Wii to fix the weird issues they have on the Wii U. You could also buy several Wii games on the eShop, but they couldn't work out whether they counted as Virtual Console games or not, but they're not emulated. They're the same way the Game Boy Advance games work on the 3DS. Nintendo then went on to release the NES and SNES Mini, but they were not that exciting. Yes, they use emulation, but that's it. All they do is play NES and SNES games. It wasn't until the Nintendo Switch that Nintendo tried a new method on how to release their older games. The Nintendo Switch took a while to get a lot of their older games on the Switch, but in the meantime we got collections like the Mega Man Legacy Collection and series such as Arcade Archives and Sega Ages. Arcade Archives re-released the arcade versions of many Nintendo classics, and I'm pretty sure this is the first time Versus Super Mario Bros. Has ever been re-released. Nintendo eventually released NES games on Nintendo Switch Online, and everyone was happy. Well, I mean, it took a while, of course, because we had to wait for more consoles, and then there was the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pass that added even more consoles, but it's finally worth it. The Switch has NES, SNES, Nintendo 64, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and Sega Mega Drive, with Japan getting an exclusive Nintendo 64 18 Plus app alongside an exclusive game for the Game Boy Advance, Mother 3. There's not that much to note here, just strange inclusions that haven't been added yet, like Super Mario Land, Super Smash Bros, or Sonic the Hedgehog 1. It's kind of insane. The emulation works great on the Switch. I mean, it took a while, but it works great now. And IQ, yes, the Nintendo Chinese division, worked on the Nintendo 64 emulators alongside some of the others too. But Nintendo isn't the only company that uses emulation to its advantage.
I bought a PS2 game on the PS5 and it uses PS2 emulation for it to exist. It's Toy Story 2, by the way, but there's really not that much to talk about it besides from the fact that you can play PS1, PS2, and PSP games on a PS5. Obviously with the PS4 it's not emulation, it just runs it, and then PS3 can go fuck itself. Both you and I know that there's a completely different side to emulation. Something that is well more known for being emulation.
PC emulation. No, the emulators itself isn't piracy.
I swear, Nintendo, don't shoot me!
But most people download ROMs from the internet.
That's the game itself.
From some random website, which is illegal. But if you manage to have a device that you can get your games legally from, like something that backs them up, then you should be all good. Nintendo games are quite possibly the most popular games to emulate on a PC from the NES all the way up to the Switch. Well, until Nintendo took the emulator down. But this is the way I experienced a lot of Nintendo's legacy games. Yeah, I like collecting a bunch of games physically, but you and I gotta agree that playing these games on a PC with a Gamecube adapter is just easier. Each emulator has its own special thing, but for the most part, RetroArch has you covered. RetroArch has emulators available for almost every single console from the Atari 2600 all the way up until the Nintendo 64, and it's quite possibly the easiest way to get into emulation. RetroArch is actually available on Steam right now alongside all the emulators for it, and it works extremely well, and personally I think it just has a great presentation and style compared to most emulators that you find online. But the fun doesn't stop there. Dolphin is the next great emulator. Dolphin has Gamecube and Wii, and there's a special version of Dolphin that uses the Triforce arcade machines. I've been using Dolphin for an extremely long time, and all of the options available from making Gamecube games widescreen to making Wii games HD, my god, I can't recommend anything better if you're looking to play a lot of classic Gamecube and Wii games. And with Gamecube game prices only getting higher, this is truly the best way to play.
I'm not enticing piracy! I would never! Just look up Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door on eBay and see the prices and then make your own decision on whether you want to emulate and pirate the game or not! I'm not enticing it though, I would never! I would never!
Many emulators have gotten into trouble though, with the most recent and popular case being the Yuzu emulator that could emulate Nintendo Switch games on your PC. Yuzu was a bit of a risky emulator to begin with. I mean, emulating a console that's currently available to purchase in the store is extremely risky business. But Yuzu was a lot of people's first way of playing several Switch games. Several games, like Super Mario Bros. Wonder and The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, leaked online early. So hackers distributed these games online before the games even released, and the emulator to play them all was Yuzu. Now of course this wasn't the Yuzu team's fault, they just made an emulator. Granted, they did lock some parts of it behind a Patreon page, but who's to say that's why they got taken down. But the Yuzu emulator was the one that helped people play these games early.
Video game companies have a bit of a history when it comes to taking down these emulators, with the most popular case being Sony trying to take down the PlayStation emulators Bleem and the Virtual Game Station. Hi, I'm Charlie, I'm back, and welcome to 1999. The Sony PlayStation is up against the Sega Saturn, the newly released Sega Dreamcast, and the Nintendo 64. PlayStation games can obviously only be played on a PlayStation, right?
Macworld 1999. Steve Jobs and Phil Schiller walk on stage to reveal the Kinetics Virtual Game Station, a way to play PlayStation games on a Macintosh. This was insane. At this point, emulators obviously existed, but they weren't as big as they are now. And suddenly, an emulator for a console that currently is still on the market is being pushed by Apple. Game consoles were always being reverse engineered, from Atari reverse engineering the NES to Accolade doing it with Sega with the Genesis. But this
was different.
At the same time, another emulator popped up for the PlayStation known as Bleem, which could not only emulate PlayStation games on the PC, but also on the Sega Dreamcast. Yeah, you could play original PlayStation games on a Dreamcast.
Sony was just a little pissed off after this. So after a bit of legal jargon, Sony was finally up against Bleem and Kinetics. And Sony had Sega and Nintendo backing them up. There is no possible way Sony can lose this lawsuit. Yet they did. These lawsuits changed emulation and their legality for the rest of time. Emulation wasn't illegal. Copying your own games to your own cartridge, backing it up, that's not illegal. But sharing that copy with other people, that's what makes it illegal. It's not emulation, it's spreading around a copy that you own to other people for free. Which is why Nintendo going after Yuzu was such an interesting situation.
The year is 2024. The Switch is in its most likely final year, and Yuzu can emulate almost everything the Switch can do. You can play new games before they come out on Yuzu, with the most popular case, as I said, being The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Apparently over 1 million copies were played before the game came out. That number does seem a bit ridiculous. No way 1 million people pirated this game, because Nintendo couldn't even get 100,000 people to buy the later Mario and Luigi games for the 3DS, but it was certainly a large amount of people. The people behind Yuzu also controlled the 3DS emulator Citra, which Nintendo wasn't really after. Nintendo was after the players of Tears of the Kingdom. So what did they do? Nintendo sued the Yuzu team for $2.4 million.
This alone was pretty much the end of the line for Yuzu. See, although Yuzu had a public Patreon,
that they were getting donations to be able to continue the type of content that they were doing, this did not cover the amount of money they needed to go to court against Nintendo. And despite the fact there was precedent with Sony losing that lawsuit about a very similar issue, in both cases the emulators shut down anyway due to a lack of funding. So Yuzu couldn't afford this, so it shut its doors alongside Citra, their 3DS emulator. This caused a spiral in the gaming community. Emulators had been taken down before by other companies, with Valve taking Dolphin off of Steam before release due to being scared of a Nintendo lawsuit, but it was never to this scale. It hadn't been like this since Bleem and Kinetics. Now there's no more of Yuzu or Citra. I mean, yeah, you can still find those emulators online if you look hard enough, but their official builds are wiped from the internet alongside their Discord servers.
And now we're here. Huge companies use emulation constantly, like Nintendo with Nintendo Switch Online and Virtual Console, and the other companies using it for their collections, like the Sega Mega Drive collections, or the Atari collections, or the other collections that exist on all these other consoles. But if you're a fan and you do it, you're doomed. Despite the legality, despite all these lawsuits, you're doomed. Now, I'm not one to use unofficial emulators that often. I might use them every now and then to record footage of, like, Back to the Future for the NES. But lots of people do actually prefer playing these games on these emulators, having a really easy way to go and play them without having to get out an NES and get the cartridge and do all that fun stuff. I know people with Dolphin installed on their laptop that carry around a Gamecube adapter so they can just play Super Smash Bros. Melee and Mario Kart Wii whenever they want. We're certainly entering an interesting era for emulators, and I'm honestly curious to see what comes next. Is this the end of it all, or is this just the beginning? Oh, come on!
Well, it can't get any worse than this. Hey!
Oh, come on!